Good evening. The Dorothy Thompson Lecture Series Committee is pleased to have cooperated with the Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice, that's MAPJ, in bringing Robert Meeropol to Kansas State University and Manhattan for this evening's lecture. MAPJ's mission is to educate and organize for peace and justice at home and abroad. This year, the organization's efforts have focused on public housing and economic justice. To many of us fortunate enough to know her, Dorothy Thompson, whose life and work are commemorated by this lecture, was an intriguing combination of persistent activist and keen observer. She was passionate about equality and fairness and objective about strategies for achieving them. She created this university's affirmative action plan, headed its first affirmative action office, and led in implementing university policies against racial and sexual harassment. Dorothy's knowledge, high standards, and intelligent advocacy led many to seek her legal guidance. Many more of us sought her friendship, for as you may remember, she was easily amused. Tonight's speaker would, I believe, have received Dorothy's wholehearted approval. He is deeply knowledgeable about the death penalty and its use in this country. He is both passionate about the political and racial motivation for its use and dispassionate about how to most effectively persuade death penalty supporters that the death penalty ought to be abolished. Robert Meeropol is the younger son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. In 1953, when he was 6 years old, the United States government executed his parents for conspiring to steal the secret of the atom bomb. He earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in anthropology from the University of Michigan and was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1985. He has been a progressive activist, author, and speaker. In the 1970s, he and his brother Michael successfully sued the FBI and the CIA to force the release of 300,000 previously secret documents about their parents. In 1990, after leaving the private practice of law, he founded the Rosenberg Fund for Children, and he now serves as the fund's executive director. The RFC provides for the educational and emotional needs of children in this country whose parents have been harassed, injured, jailed, lost jobs, or died in the course of their progressive activities. In the past 9 years, the RFC has built an endowment of over $1 million, awarded grants totaling $500,000, and now has 7,500 supporters nationwide. In 1999, the RFC awarded $145,000 for the benefit of more than 120 children in the United States. As you might imagine, the fund needs your financial support. Please pick up a newsletter right there on the table, which will tell you how to donate to the Rosenberg Fund for Children. Mr. Meeropol's talk tonight is the death penalty, the Rosenbergs, and Mumia Abu-Jamal. During the last decade, he has spoken widely in support of efforts to abolish capital punishment. He is a founding endorser of the campaign to end the death penalty and an advisory board member of the Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty. Please join me in welcoming Robert Meeropol to Manhattan.
Well, I'm glad to be here this evening. I want to thank you for that introduction and for the lecture series, for inviting me and the co-sponsorship and all of those people who've been involved in bringing me to Manhattan. I guess as someone who was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, I should feel at home here, going from one apple to the other. Talking about capital punishment, the Rosenberg case, the current capital case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, all in one lecture, that's quite a lot of ground to cover. So I hope you'll forgive me if I paint with a rather broad brush. I'm not going to talk all that much about the facts of my parents' case, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have in the question and answer period. I'm also not going to talk that much about the Rosenberg Fund for Children, but again, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about any of these topics. It seems to me that about once a generation, our government has to demonstrate the dangerous nature of those who seek to transform our society by executing those who symbolize radical social movements. The death penalty against my parents must have staggered those who worked to save Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian immigrant anarchists wrongfully executed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the 1920s. To the supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti, it must have seemed that the 1950s was about to be a repeat of the 1920s. Now, in the struggle to save Mumia Abu-Jamal's life, those who work to save my parents fear that at the beginning of the 21st century, we are going to see not only the 1920s, but the 1950s repeated. And that's in part why there has been such a massive international movement demanding a new trial for Mumia Abu-Jamal. You may not be aware of this, but on April 23rd, 1999, 105,000 teachers in Brazil called off classes and instead discussed the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. On the same day, the Longshoremen's Union for the entire West Coast, the ports of San Diego, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, no cargo was unloaded off any vessel, nor was any vessel loaded on that day in protest against the possible execution of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And there were many more instances of things like that on that day and that have happened since. Many of you are not aware of them because they just simply don't get reported on the evening news. You don't see them in USA Today or the New York Times or any of our other major print media. And it's not surprising that with the success of this movement, the growth of this movement, as happened in the 1950s, it's the movement itself that becomes the focus of attack. So that, for instance, 2020, the ABC television documentary series had a special program about Mumia Abu-Jamal, which they entitled Hollywood's Unlikely Hero. In fact, they have shown that a couple of times, and I predict it will be shown more times. And what that show was really about was not so much about the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, though I think it served as a pretty good infomercial for an execution. But what they focused instead on was a portrayal of the broad coalition that's working to save his life as a group of ignorant, starstruck hero worshippers who think that Mumia is perfect in every way and couldn't recognize a more complex truth if it jumped up and hit them in the nose. The attacks focus on the movement. And I'm not surprised by this because in my parents' case, as this attack or as this movement to save their life in 1951, 1952, and finally in 1953, the year of their execution. As this movement grew and expanded and became the largest social movement in this country in the early 1950s until Martin Luther King began the Montgomery bus boycott and we started the civil rights movement, the very success of that movement led to it being attacked. And I believe that at this point there is actually a concerted effort to portray the movement to save Mumia Abu-Jamal's life as both ignorant and monolithic, just as there was an effort to do the same with my parents. And I believe that's a false picture of both movements. And I also believe it's a dangerous picture, because anything that portrays the movement as narrow and monolithic is going to drive people away from it. And this will only increase the chances that Mumia will be executed. And it's particularly galling to me on a personal level because I've spent a good portion of time during the last 5 or 6 years speaking around the country, demonstrating that there actually are a broad range of perspectives of the people who are working in this movement. Well, as I said, it's happening again, but maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In the 1990s, as was said in the introduction, as the executive director of the Rosenberg Fund for Children, I've frequently spoken about my parents' case, I've talked about capital punishment, and I've talked a lot about the people who the Rosenberg Fund for Children are helping today. But I've actually been speaking about my parents' case since the 1970s. Now, during that reopening effort, I was traveling in Philadelphia, and I was interviewed. There was a young radio journalist, an African-American radio journalist who had a talk show, a radio show, and he gave me an hour of airtime, and we discussed my parents' case. And at the end of this interview, he asked me the question that had been asked me many times. Did I believe that something like my parents' case, did I believe if my parents' case could happen again in this country? And we both discussed this a little bit, and we both agreed that yes, it could happen again. And now that interviewer, Mumia Abu-Jamal, himself is on death row. In fact, he is the first political prisoner in this country to face execution since my parents. Now, so why do I care so much about Mumia's case? Well, I see it as my parents' case happening all over again. My parents were executed because they were communists who would not confess. The recently released CIA material says my mother wasn't a spy. FBI documents describe my mother not as guilty, but as, quote, cognizant and recalcitrant. When Mumia began writing for the Black Panther Party newspaper in Philadelphia as a teenager in the 1960s, the FBI placed him under surveillance. He remained under FBI surveillance until the day of his arrest 15 years later. The Philadelphia that Mumia grew up in was notorious for police violence. Frank Rizzo, the chief of police, and then Philadelphia's mayor, was notorious for condoning that violence. And Mumia grew up and became a radio journalist. He was called the voice of the voiceless, and he relentlessly attacked police brutality on his radio show. And the Philadelphia police hated Mumia. Once, when Mumia asked a probing question of Rizzo at a press conference, Rizzo responded, quote, "One day you will be held accountable for your actions." Mumia's case is particularly important to me because the forces of oppression have targeted him. I guess you could say that, like my mother, Mumia is both cognizant and recalcitrant. Well, and it bears repeating that in the 1970s and 80s, he was a radio journalist who continually criticized the racist acts of the Philadelphia Police Department. Now, Mumia was tried and convicted of killing a policeman in 1982. And like my parents, his claims that he never received a fair trial have not been adequately aired in the mainstream media. Now, Leonard Weinglass, one of his attorneys, described Mumia's case this way in 1997. He said, quote, "The legal papers, based on years of investigation, research, and review, demonstrate unequivocally that Mumia was a victim of a politically motivated, racially biased prosecution in which evidence of his innocence was suppressed. He was denied his most fundamental rights to a fair trial and appeal." Now, this hardly sounds to me like wild-eyed claims that Mumia was a saint. Let's take another look at what some other people say about Mumia's case. More particularly Amnesty International, which is known for its independent investigation of cases. In fact, our government is very fond of, whenever we want to point to human rights abuses in other countries, we point to some report by Amnesty International that shows how abusive those countries have been of a fair judicial process. But of course, when Amnesty International comes and talks about our own situation, then we want to ignore them. But here's what Amnesty said about Mumia's case. Amnesty International has serious doubts about the fairness of Mr. Abu-Jamal's trial, which may have been contaminated by the deep-rooted racism that appears to taint the application of the death penalty in Pennsylvania. Mr. Abu-Jamal's case serves to highlight some of the particularly egregious aspects of the application of the death penalty in the United States: racism in jury selection, questionable identification evidence, possible pressure on witnesses, the withholding of evidence from the defense, a questionable purported confession, incompetent trial counsel, and inadequate funding for the defense. The questioning of Mumia Abu-Jamal about his past political beliefs and affiliations at the sentencing proceeding alone presents grounds for commuting his death sentence. Well, that's what Amnesty had to say, which I would submit is hardly a radical organization. Well, of course, Mumia's case was reviewed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But what about the fairness of his appeal? Well, when Mumia appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in October of 1998, the court unanimously denied his appeal. One of the justices sitting on his appeal was Mr. Justice Ronald Castile. Now, Mr. Justice Castile had previously been a member of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and as a member of the District Attorney's Office, he'd actually signed a prior motion that Mumia's attorneys had filed. In other words, someone who'd been a member of the prosecution team was now sitting as an impartial judge in judgment over this appeal. So Mumia's attorneys did what any good attorney would do. They asked the judge to recuse himself, which means to remove himself from hearing this because he had an interest in the case. And in asking Justice Castile to remove himself, they pointed out further that this justice, when he ran for office recently, because they're elected officials, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court are elected, they're not appointed, that he received the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police, which was organizing a campaign to have Mumia killed. So it seemed once again it was another demonstration of his bias. So here's what Mr. Castile said in response when he refused to recuse himself. He said, "At the onset, I note the very same FOP, that's Fraternal Order of Police, which endorsed me during earlier electoral processes, also endorsed Mr. Chief Justice John P. Flattery, Mr. Justice Ralph Cappy, Mr. Justice Russell M. Nigro, and Madam Justice Sandra Schultz Newman. If the FOP's endorsement constituted a basis for recusal, practically the entire court would be required to decline participation in this appeal." That's what he said. Well, I think it's wonderful when your opponent makes your point for you. It also says something about electing your Supreme Court judges, because this guy evidently wasn't smart enough to realize he was doing it. So for these Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices sitting and making this decision, for them it was a career decision. It was an electoral decision. It was a decision to guarantee their re-election. It had very little to do with justice. But of course, the press won't report any of this. What gets reported is that those fighting to save Mumia's life are ignorant, naive, and monolithic. The fact is that both my parents' supporters and Mumia's supporters have a wide range of views. And interestingly to me, there's actually a striking similarity between those range of views. For instance, some working to save my parents' lives in the 1950s believed that my parents were totally innocent, that they were merely two young Jewish working-class Americans, members of the American Communist Party, ensnared because they were communists and Jews, not because they were spies. Others didn't agree with that, but they believed that my parents might have had some connection to something illegal, but that the charge against them, that they stole the secret of the atomic bomb, was absurd on its face. As one top atomic scientist put it, building the atomic bomb was an industry, not a recipe. In other words, these people believed that my parents were not guilty as charged. A few had read the trial transcript. They saw how biased my parents' trial judge Kaufman was, and they didn't take a position on guilt or innocence. They simply said that such an unfair trial didn't prove anything. And finally, others also took no position on guilt or innocence, but they felt that the death penalty was morally wrong. Now, if you look at Mumia's case and the positions that people are taking today, you'll find that there are those who believe that Mumia is an innocent victim of a politically motivated frame-up, that he did absolutely nothing wrong and should be freed immediately, that they believe he was convicted because he was an African-American, ex-Black Panther, and MOVE sympathizer, not because he was guilty of committing this crime. But others point out that all the witnesses agree that Mumia was in his cab in the middle of the night when he came upon. Now, Mumia was this radio journalist. He was broadcasting, I should explain, on alternative radio stations, didn't make a lot of money, and he was driving a cab to make some extra money at night. Well, he was driving his cab in the middle of the night, downtown Philadelphia, when he came upon a fight between his brother and a policeman. All agree that Mumia got out of his car, ran towards his brother and the policeman. All agree that gunfire then broke out, that Mumia and the policeman were shot. The prosecution and the defense agree on all of this. But of course, there's a wide disparity of views on who shot who and what order. But some people say even if the prosecution is totally correct, that Mumia drew the handgun he was licensed to carry and shot the cop, under these circumstances, he could be guilty of no more than manslaughter. That this just couldn't be first-degree premeditated murder. In other words, Mumia, these people believe, was not guilty as charged, just as some believed about my parents. Now, still others point out how unfair the trial judge was in Mumia's case, that Mumia had incompetent counsel. In fact, counsel begged to be removed from the case, saying he was unprepared to go forward, but the judge refused. They point out that counsel was provided a tiny investigatory budget, and that the only investigator he was able to hire quit shortly afterwards because he wasn't paid anything. In fact, that not a single witness was interviewed by the defense. They also point out that just as with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Judge Sabo, the trial court judge, was a member of the Fraternal Order of Police. As in my parents' case, these people take no position on Mumia's guilt or innocence. They simply say that such an unfair trial couldn't prove anything. Finally, others simply say that the death penalty is wrong, or that the punishment is too harsh under the circumstances. My point is that there are many views here, but those working to save Mumia Abu-Jamal's life may not all agree that he's innocent, but they all agree that he deserves a new trial. For me, that's the issue in the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. It's not guilt or innocence, because you can't determine guilt or innocence until you have a fair trial. That's why he needs a fair trial, in order to make that determination. There's another parallel I also want to make, and that's a more personal one. You know, as with my parents, Mumia has family. He too has children. What does it feel like to have a family member executed? What does it feel like to have a family member on death row? It's important to work to save the life of Mumia Abu-Jamal and all those other people on death row, so that these families will not be torn apart as my family was. You know, the death penalty that Pennsylvania still seeks to impose, it won't make that state a safer place. It will not bring back Officer Faulkner, the police officer who was killed. It will not heal his shattered family, but it will further shatter Mumia's family. You know, there are some who are against capital punishment on purely moral grounds. And I have to make a confession that I am anti-capital punishment on purely moral grounds. I just feel it is wrong. But you know, such beliefs can be either religious or ethical, but I don't believe that such beliefs can be the core of our efforts to end capital punishment in this country. Because as with many moral beliefs, no matter how passionately we feel about them, there's going to be somebody else who feels that it's not morally wrong. And it's not like you can have an intellectual discussion with that person and convince them to change their morality. That's just not the way things work. But you know, as with any deeply divisive issue, you're going to find there are people very strongly on one side and people very strongly on the other, but then there are people in the middle who don't feel so strongly one way or the other. And you know, there is a growing anti-capital punishment movement in this country. And I think this movement has to focus its attention on those who are uncertain. And I think this is how we can do it most effectively. For me, as I've traveled and spoken on capital punishment, the argument that has carried the greatest weight is the argument that capital punishment requires perfection. Think about it. You cannot execute someone and then say, whoops, I made a mistake, and bring that person back. And also think about it. Human beings are incapable of perfection. We are incapable of coming up with a perfect system. Every time we try to come up with a perfect system, we discover it's not so perfect after all. So what does that mean? If we cannot create a perfect system and capital punishment requires perfection, it means that it's inevitable, if you have capital punishment, that an innocent person is going to be executed. It's inevitable. It cannot be avoided. That means if you support capital punishment, you are supporting the execution of an innocent person. There's no escaping it. And I find that most Americans do not support the execution of innocent people. Now, you know, there are those who can point out using statistics that capital punishment is racist, that, you know, it's going to be applied unevenly against people of color. They point out that there's a class bias. If you've got enough money, you can hire good lawyers and you can avoid execution. These are both true, and we should not neglect pointing this out. But I've also found that possibly because our country has never gotten over its racism, and possibly because our country seems to blame the poor for being poor, that people don't seem to care that much that the system is racist or that there's a class bias in the system. But they do care about the execution of innocent people. Now, but you know, the biggest thing I come up across, particularly on college campuses, where a lot of people are thinking about this, is that they tend to see capital punishment as an individual question. Capital punishment is not about the execution of a particular individual. Let me say that again. Capital punishment in the United States is not about the execution of a particular individual. Now, I'm sure there are a bunch of you sitting out there saying, what is this guy saying? It's crazy. What does he mean? Capital punishment in the United States is an institution. Okay? You know, I know a lot of you go through a chain of thought. You're sitting there and you're thinking, or you're arguing with your friends about capital punishment, and you envision the most horrible murderer, say somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, or somebody who, you know, Timothy McVeigh, convicted of blowing up a building, killing 162 people, including killing people in a daycare center. You think about people like that and you say, that person deserves to die. I would favor that person's execution. And therefore, I am in favor of capital punishment. The problem is that capital punishment in the United States is not about the execution of those two individuals. It's a system. It's a system set into motion by thousands of county prosecutors and district attorneys who all have the power to make a decision of whether to charge somebody with a capital crime or to charge them with a less than capital crime. It is a decision made by people who are more frequently than not elected government officials. The very same officials that we don't trust to spend our tax dollars, that we don't trust to put up traffic lights in the proper intersections, the same government officials who we make all sorts of jokes about how inefficient and ineffective and stupid they are, and we want to give these same people the power of life and death. And then we go into a judicial system. These prosecutors bring capital cases to a judicial system which we know is flawed, which we know people are wrongly convicted. And then we want to bring them into an appeals process in which the same thing is repeated again. And what is the result? The result is you get the horrible mass murderers on death row, and you get some 17-year-old black kid in the state of Mississippi who drove a getaway car in a robbery of a 7-Eleven, who never even touched a gun in the entire process, and because of the felony murder rule, he's on death row, facing execution. And then, of course, you get all those people in Illinois who have been demonstrably shown through DNA testing and other admissions to be innocent. And why are they walking the streets today? It's not because of the judicial process. It's because some crusading journalism professor had his students investigate capital cases, and they uncovered the police corruption. And that led to these people being freed. It is a system. It's not about the execution of any particular individual. You know, but despite all of this, there are simply some people you can't reason with. They really don't care that capital punishment doesn't deter. You know, it's actually true there, of the 38 jurisdictions in the United States that have capital punishment, and those jurisdictions, well, let's pull the federal jurisdiction out, and we'll say the 37 states that have capital punishment. The murder rate in those 37 states is actually higher than in the 13 states, including my own state of Massachusetts, which doesn't have capital punishment. They don't care that this doesn't deter. They don't care that it isn't cheaper, doesn't save money. They don't care that it isn't fairly applied. They don't care that its application is racist. You know, Pennsylvania has a death row of about 200 people. 125 of them come from Philadelphia. And 89% of those people on death row from Philadelphia are people of color. They don't care about any of that. These people want the state to act as the public instrument of their private revenge. That's what it comes down to. Some of them actually like the idea of killing, and they derive gratification from it. You know, we've all heard about the tailgate parties outside the gates of prisons where executions take place and people cheering. It provides an outlet for the violence within these people. They are actually the violent ones. They are the ones who we should be worried about. They are a symptom of a sickness in our society. And state-sanctioned executions only pander to their bloodlust. So the fight against the death penalty and to save Mumia Abu-Jamal, you know, it's a broader fight than that too, I should say. It's not just about saving 3,600 people who are currently on death row in this country. This is the kind of activity that sparks a lifetime of commitment to activism. I've had a number of instances where I've been speaking somewhere and some really aged person has come up to me and said, you know, I want to tell you that the first time I ever got involved in social protest in this country was when I worked to save Sacco and Vanzetti's life back in the 1920s. I've actually met people in their 90s come up and said that. And they've said, and I've been working ever since. And then I've met many people in my parents' generation and somewhat younger who are actively involved in the work to save my parents' case, and that sparked a lifetime of commitment in them. So those people who want to join the forces of fighting to save death row inmates are joining some very powerful currents. If you want to get involved in this activity, you are really becoming a part of a monumental struggle. And it's not only about the death penalty, because the death penalty in this country at this point has to takes place within the context of increasing mass imprisonment in this country. You know, we're talking about, there are 2 million people in prison in this country today. 41% of them, by the way, are African American. And that population of 2 million is skyrocketing, even as the crime rate goes down. I don't have the most recent figures, but in 1998, $27 billion was spent on prison construction. You know, it's almost like building of prisons is sort of taking over for the slack in the defense industry in the wake of the Cold War. Instead of the military-industrial complex, we have the prison-industrial complex. You know, the dark-skinned or young dark-skinned criminal in the street is replacing the foreign-sponsored communist as the thing we're supposed to fear the most these days, the latest excuse to gut the Bill of Rights. And we find congressmen from mostly rural districts vying with one another to have prisons built in their districts to provide jobs for their constituents, and then those prisons are quickly filled up with people of color from various inner cities around the country. You know, this has become big business. We have publicly traded prison corporations on the New York Stock Exchange. You too can buy stock in a prison and make a lot of money. And evidently people are doing it. Well, and there are 3,600 inmates on death row today whose lives are at stake. And the effort to save their lives is really a focal point of this struggle. In the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, which has become the showdown case on racism and capital punishment in America today, it's going to be the biggest struggle of all. So one of our jobs, those of us who are interested in this struggle, is to spread the word to others. Because fighting for Mumia's life is the battle for the lives of all those on death row. And it's important, one of the things we can do is spread the word, because most people still don't know what the state of Pennsylvania may still do. We must all do what we can, each in our own way, and working together to make sure that what happened to my parents and my family does not happen to Mumia Abu-Jamal and his family. We must make sure that history does not repeat itself yet again. Thank you. Now, I didn't go on too long because, at least I hope you don't think I went on too long, because I wanted to leave a good period of time for back and forth and question and answers. And I understand, what do we have, mics set up here? People want to ask questions. I would welcome them on topics that I've spoken of and topics that I haven't. Though I can't promise you I'll know the answers to everything you ask.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Rosenberg Fund for Children, and also if you could tell us what we could do collectively about Mumia Abu-Jamal's death penalty.
Okay. Well, I guess I don't have to repeat the question since it was mic'd. Rosenberg Fund for Children, is a public foundation that provides for the educational and emotional needs of children in this country whose parents have been targeted in the course of their progressive activities. And if any of you are interested in the details of the fund, as was said, there are newsletters down front. And I hope you will take one. There's still quite a few available, and the more you take, the less I'll have to carry home with me. The short version of the story of the Rosenberg Fund for Children is that when I was a child, after my parents' arrest, a lot of terrible things happened to me in the period between 1950, when I was 3 years old, and 1955, when I was 8. And what the fund is doing is we try to find children today who are suffering the same kind of nightmare that I suffered as a child, and we try to help them by connecting them to supportive services. We don't do food, clothing, and shelter. It's too much for us. But we do everything from therapy to summer camp to private school tuition to cultural classes of one sort or another. The kind of things that can enrich a child's life. And I urge you to pick up a newsletter and read more about it. In terms of Mumia's case has reached a critical stage. After years of being in state court, Mumia is finally filed in federal court for a writ of habeas corpus, basically filing for a federal review of his claims. And the judge will hold a hearing sometime during the next month, and then we'll issue a ruling. And, you know, recent changes in federal law enable the judge, whose name is Judge Yan, to avoid making an independent factual review. The law was changed. Up until 1996, that's what the federal courts did routinely. Now the law says that they have to grant deference to the state court's factual findings. Now, I think it's very important for all of us to let Judge Yan know that he must review all the evidence in this case. That if he's going to accept the factual findings of trial court Judge Sabo, Judge Sabo, in the last ruling, in Mumia's last appeal, made 153 findings of fact in his case. He adopted word for word the factual statements of the prosecution in 153 out of 153 instances. He found every single defense witness incredible and every single prosecution witness credible. In the instances in which prosecution witnesses changed their story and became defense witnesses, the same people who he'd previously found credible, he now found incredible. If the judge is going to take, the federal judge is going to take as a given the factual findings of this judge, that's no review whatsoever. That is the form of a review without the substance of a review. And once he makes such a finding, if he does, it will be very difficult to reverse that decision on appeal, and Mumia's life will be in grave danger. So the most important thing to do at this point is to write a letter to Judge Yan asking him to review the facts of Mumia's case. And the way these letters are being collected are through Mumia's defense attorney, Lenny Weinglass, in New York City. And I can tell you, if you go on the web and look at a website entitled Justice for, the word justice, then the number 4, Mumia, at, I'm going to garble this address, Justice for Mumia, I guess you're going to have to, of course it ends with .org, not .com. But I guess you're going to have to find this on the web. I'm sure you can, looking up Mumia Abu-Jamal. The other way to find this out is to get in touch with us at the Rosenberg Fund for Children. We have all the information, and we'll be happy to give it to you. Anybody who gets our newsletter has our website, can communicate. But that's the simplest thing right now. My understanding is that there are already at least 25,000 such letters that have been collected by the legal staff. And the hope is, it may actually be getting up closer to 50,000. And the hope is to gather 100,000 by the time the hearing is held. So that's where we stand right now. Other questions?
Mr. Meeropol, you and I come from different backgrounds. Your parents were executed. My father was murdered. You're an attorney. I work in law enforcement, been in law enforcement for 10 years. And I can tell you and the audience that everything you've said tonight is absolutely accurate. The death penalty not only is racist in Pennsylvania, it is here in Kansas. We are systematically offering we're offering the opportunity for individuals to take murder pleas if they are a white defendant. We are refusing to do that with black defendants in the state. We have 4 people on death row now, and we have the opportunity to tell our state government that this is not the way to go. We're collecting a petition called the Not in My Name campaign, which that woman in the pink blouse over here has copies of, and I have copies of, if anybody would like to have one of those and sign it before they leave tonight. She's also the daughter of a murder victim. So if anyone would like to talk with either of us at the end of the program, we'd welcome the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, and I really hope people will do that. You know, it's one of the best ways to become involved is to do something, to take a small act. You know, a lot of times we're overwhelmed. We think it's such a big system. There's so many people. You know, what can we do to make a difference? And there's one way to make sure that we won't make a difference, and that is if we don't do anything. But it doesn't take a tremendous amount. What I always say to people is, don't try to take on the world. Just do something. Just take one action. Just sign this letter, get in touch with people, get on a mailing list, see what you can do, and take it one step at a time. Because a lot of people doing a little bit can really make a difference. And I want to talk about, you know, I'm really proud to meet people who have had relatives murdered who are active in the effort to end capital punishment. You know, in some ways, I see myself in the same boat. I firmly believe that my parents were framed. That I'm not going to try to argue that in any great detail, and I want to say that I'm not making a claim that neither Ethel nor Julius Rosenberg ever did anything wrong, or that I claim that both of them were totally and completely innocent. That's not the claim I'm actually making, though I'm not saying I don't believe that. The claim that I'm making is that they were framed, they did not receive a fair trial, and that they did not do the thing they were killed for. That is, they did not steal the secret of the atomic bomb. And the government knew that they didn't steal the secret of the atomic bomb, and certain government officials, knowing this, conspired with other government officials in a chain of actions that led to my parents' execution. Let me give you an example of why I believe that, and focus on my mother for a minute. You know, FBI agents in their memoirs, some have published memoirs about this case later, said, we didn't want them to die, referring to my parents. We wanted them to talk. There's a general acknowledgement that capital punishment in my parents' case was used not as punishment but as coercion. The whole point was to get them to say what the government wanted them to say, and if they could give a capital sentence, particularly against my mother, they thought it would force my father to cooperate. They were so certain that my father was going to cooperate that the CIA, in cooperation with the FBI, set up a list of questions they were going to ask my father after he agreed to cooperate. And we, under our Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, got these lists of questions. And the sixth question on the list was your wife cognizant of your espionage activities? Not was she involved, but was she aware of them? Now that's a hell of a question to ask about someone you're about to execute. Now, given that, I view my mother as a murder victim. And I know that as a teenager, I wanted there to be some sort of judicial reckoning, and I wanted the people who killed my parents to be killed themselves. Well, what did I want? I wanted revenge. But you know, revenge is a very base emotion. It is an animal instinct. It is something that we seek personally to exorcise our own demons is, do we want the state to act as the vehicle of revenge? Wouldn't it be better if our state acted as an embodiment of our highest aspirations rather than our most base emotions? Isn't it dangerous to give the state that kind of power and to act on that kind of motivation? Is that the way we want our government to behave? Well, it took me a long time to come to that and to realize that I didn't even want the people who were responsible for my parents' execution to be killed. And I think, you know, that realization, when I finally achieved that realization, I understood that I really was against capital punishment. And so I salute those people, murder victim family members who are working in this effort. Yeah.
It's really good to have you here in support of what you're saying. I've heard of a case of a man whose son was killed, murdered, and he made it his personal vendetta to go after that person and bring him to justice, which he did, and to see that he was executed, which he did, and he sat and watched the execution and was asked by a reporter later, how do you feel? And his response was to the effect that, well, the guy really didn't suffer enough. Mm-hmm. And it says to me that there is no end for revenge. And I think it's a great favor that you and Bill Lucero and others that have spoken that have gone through the depths of loss are able to transcend that and to speak out of principle rather than, as you put it, the basest passion. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your comments. Yeah.
I was wondering how widely accepted that is. The reason I ask that is a few years ago when I was in high school, all I remember learning about your parents was just kind of the fact that we just kind of breezed through it. It was just a fact that they were spies, they were convicted, and we just kind of breezed past it. That was it. I was wondering
typical.
How widely accepted
Yes.
it is. And also, a second question. I was wondering if I'm pretty ignorant on this. I was just wondering your opinion on this. I was, let's see, I forgot if he was Chinese or Japanese, but the man that was convicted of some sort of spying at the nuclear plant.
Well, he hasn't been convicted of anything.
Oh, he hasn't yet? Okay, good.
But perhaps what you're saying sort of reflects the press stories where people get convicted before they even get charged. I'm not, I'm trying to remember the man's name. He's Chinese. But there's been a battle over whether he was going to be indicted for a long time. Questions of evidence. I think that we just have to, with that case, we have to keep open minds. We have to look at the facts. We have to avoid saying just because some people in Congress who are trying to get reelected are getting up there and talking about how our security has been compromised and what terrible things happen. We have to keep in mind that this person has not been tried, has not been found guilty, and that it is just such situations when you can trust the courts the least. But I don't claim to be an expert on that case and to know. I just think all my antennae from my own experience teach me to be very cautious, and very careful. As for my parents' cases, it's widely accepted. Well, I think the most common position in my parents' case among people who are under 50 years old is Ethel and Julius who? There is probably just general ignorance or some vague knowledge, aren't they the spies who got killed? So, what I'm saying is, yes, is not widely accepted. However, if you are knowledgeable on the debate in the case, if you're among the people who discuss this in public, what you will find vis-a-vis my mother is, of course, those who feel this was an injustice are going to say, see, that proves it. and they feel that they've gotten all the more facts, and I've only scraped the surface. But those who, in one way or another, try to justify the government's activity kind of have a schizophrenic approach to my parents' case, particularly as it regards to my mother. On the one hand, they say things like, well, the recent evidence shows Ethel Rosenberg may have played only a very peripheral role. But then later on, when they start talking about stealing the secret of the atomic bomb, they lapse into the plural, the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs. Perhaps one of the most incredible examples of this comes from USA Today. When the Venona transcriptions, the CIA documents I referred to, were released in July of 1995, they're only 80 pages long. They're on the internet. Anybody can look at them. One of the things that came out in looking at these files was that it said Ethel Rosenberg wasn't the spy. She was never given a code name, and she wasn't involved, actively involved, which of course is consistent with the whole FBI line of her being, quote, cognizant and recalcitrant rather than guilty. And so in view of this kind of material that was released that any reporter could read, what did USA Today, what was the headline the next day in USA Today? Soviet documents incriminate Rosenbergs. Now, first of all, that's an amazing headline because there were no Soviet documents. They were only CIA documents. The only documentary evidence came from our own government. What the CIA said was they intercepted electronic transmissions. In other words, they plucked things out of the airwaves and wrote them down and decrypted them. That's not a Soviet document. That's an American document. And second of all, these decrypted, transcribed transcripts said Ethel Rosenberg wasn't the spy. So then you get the headline, Soviet documents incriminate Rosenbergs. Well, if that's what the public's going to read, that's what the public's going to accept. It tells you to take anything you read in USA Today with actually, I was going to say a grain of salt, but I think probably a whole salt lick is more likely to be in order. Other questions? Yeah.
I actually just wanted to make a comment, and I invite you to say what you think about what I have to say. But I think it's pretty interesting that the last speaker brought up the case of Wen Ho Lee, who's this Chinese spy. And the fact that he's Chinese and not Japanese is actually very important, I think, in this case, because, as the United States is agreeing to let China into WTO, and there've been a lot of things with Chinese policy towards or American policy towards China, and I think that the reason is because there's a real chance that the United States will be able to wipe out the last remnants of communism in China. And so the fact that they can prosecute Wen Ho Lee, who there's very little evidence that he did spying at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, is actually part, I think, of the effort to open the Chinese market and to wipe out the remnants of Chinese communism. And I think that fits in with the nature of the death penalty in America, and the fact that the Rosenbergs and Mumia Abu-Jamal are class enemies. They called for fundamental change in the structure of the United States government, and not for, they weren't just calling for reforms, they actually wanted fundamental differences. And so I sort of see the nature of the death penalty in this country as an instrument as a class weapon, as an instrument to keep class enemies down. And also, you're talking about the burgeoning prison industrial complex. I think that also cannot be separated from the capitalist class nature of the United States government. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because, I'm from California, and so I was at the Millions for Mumia March on April 24th, where the International Longshore Workers Union was present, as you said, and they stopped work on that day. But they were there under a leadership at that April 24th demonstration, which called for a new trial for Mumia. Now, I have fundamental problems with this slogan of a new trial for Mumia, and the reason I do is because, first of all, the 4 cops who killed Amadou Diallo were just acquitted of every single charge. We have the trial. We have the case of Reuben Hurricane Carter in the movies, who was convicted twice and he was innocent both times. There's cases, Rodney King, over and over again, people who are clearly innocent have been convicted by the judicial system of the United States, and I see no reason why, if Mumia is granted a new trial, the same thing won't happen. And I think this is further true because if you look at the logistics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but as I see it, Mumia's current appeal is a habeas corpus appeal, which is pending. Now, if this appeal is accepted by the court system, Mumia is released. His conviction is overturned. Therefore, a new trial actually is a concession to the prosecution because it would put a new trial on an already free man whose conviction has been overturned. But the reason I think this is an important question is because, as a lot of people get really interested in this Mumia Abu-Jamal case and are really interested in freeing this man, when they go to these demonstrations and they're led under these slogans of new trial by really reformist leadership who don't see any fundamental problems with the United States, that it really creates a lot of illusions in their political outlook and the political outlook of others. And I think that the real question in the Mumia Abu-Jamal case is to expose the death penalty for what it is, as an instrument of class oppression that's used to support the class nature of the government in line with the prison industrial complex and things like that. And I think that the calling for a new trial for Mumia Abu-Jamal is really counterposed. So
Okay.
I would see what you think.
You've raised a lot of interesting points. You've raised a lot of interesting points. I'm not sure I can address them all. My feeling on the new trial movement is I feel that if we confine ourselves to saying free Mumia Abu-Jamal, we are narrowing the movement to a point where it cannot save him. I want to save his life. That's my primary objective, and I think the best way to do that is to build the broadest mass movement we can in order to do so. And I think having a coalition that includes people that are saying the kind of things that you're saying, and includes people who are saying that he should have a new trial, and includes people who are saying he shouldn't be executed no matter what, just plain old anti-capital punishment people, the broadest spectrum, that is the best way to save his life. And I think it's counterproductive for those who believe in one position to attack those who hold another position. I think it narrows the movement and it makes it more likely that he'll be killed. In terms of the likelihood of him being reconvicted at another trial, actually I think that's quite unlikely. I don't, as an attorney, as someone who's worked within the judicial system, as a law clerk to an appeals court judge, I have few illusions about the fairness of our judicial system. But while you can cite instances in which, there have been retrials and reconvictions and unfair reconvictions, you can also cite instances of retrials and non-convictions. I think in Mumia's case, given the nature of the case against him, given the evidence that can be amassed in his favor, given the quality of the defense team and the national attention that will be focused upon it, I actually think he would not be reconvicted. In fact, I think one of the reasons the state of Pennsylvania is fighting so hard to deny him a new trial is that they know they can't win a trial. But, that's a matter of opinion. We can disagree on that. In terms of habeas corpus, you can't predict that that's the way it works. The judge could rule all sorts of things. He could rule that not to free Mumia. I think the least likely ruling Judge Yan is going to make is to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, to grant the habeas corpus petition and free him. I think that's the least likely thing that will happen in April, unless this judge wants to be strung up from the nearest lamppost. That, I think, is very unlikely to happen in the United States today. I think the best we can hope for is either him making a ruling that he's going to make an independent, factual, and full review of the case independently. And if he does, that essentially becomes a retrial of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and it could result in his being freed. But I don't know. It's very, working for judges, I find it's really hard to predict what they're going to do. I don't know if that answers all your questions, but the point I want to emphasize, again, is that the broadest possible coalition of people, one of the problems that I find with the people who say, free Mumia, okay, is that they already know the answer. They already know this guy is innocent. How are we going to reach out to the unconvinced if what we're saying is we know the answer? How are we going to reach out with that kind of claim? How are we going to reach out to the American public in general by saying, this guy is about to be executed because he's a class enemy? I mean, how many Americans are going to understand that kind of language, respond to it? How are we going to build a movement to save his life when we talk that way, even if we agree with it? I just don't think it works. So then talking about capital punishment as an instrument of class oppression. It is an instrument of class oppression. And in fact, capital punishment in this country was used most widely in the 19th century against the labor movement. That's sort of its roots. And that's one of the reasons why some people in the labor movement are beginning to come around on this issue, because they understand how it can be used. And there's no doubt when we talk about racism and class bias that it is primarily an instrument of repression. And that if you look at my parents' case, you look at Sacco and Vanzetti's case, it is used as a political club to beat down those who we fear. So I agree with you on that. I just might not use the same language.
I've got several questions.
Sure.
You allege that Mr. Mumia Jamal received an unfair trial.
Yeah.
What's your basis for that?
Okay, what's my basis for the fact that he received an unfair trial? Well,
You mentioned ineffective counsel.
yeah, well, first of all, he had a lawyer who asked to be removed from the case. The judge refused. He ultimately was given a second seat, what we call backup counsel.
Which was at Mumia's request.
Well, no, actually,
Because he
Mumia
wanted to
requested
represent
somebody
himself
else. Yeah, what?
According to the
Yeah,
trial transcript, Mr. Jamal wanted to represent himself. pro se.
According, I assume what you have there is the transcript from the
This is the
Fraternal
common
Order of Police website.
No, actually, this is from the transcript from the court.
Yeah, well, he asked for him to be backup counsel because he had no choice. He wanted to have someone else be backup counsel. He
was not a
actually
lawyer.
wanted to represent himself. But the point is
He
that
was
Mumia was
granted
then
pro se.
refused. What?
He was granted the right to pro se.
Well, he was granted, let me tell you what happened.
But
Mumia was granted the right to represent himself. And he started representing himself. And I've read the trial transcript, at least
became
this far.
belligerent,
Right. Well, no, wait.
uncooperative.
You've asked me a question. You have to, if you don't let me answer it, what's the point?
All right.
Okay. Mumia was asked to represent himself because what happened is just before the pretrial proceeding began, his counsel got up and said, "Your Honor, I'm unprepared." And Mumia said, the judge said, "Well, you have to go ahead. I'm not going to let you get off this case." So then Mumia said, "Your Honor, I don't like this. I'm going to represent myself." The judge said, "Okay, you can represent yourself, but if you're disruptive, I'm going to remove you." Okay. So then we have the pretrial proceeding begins. It goes on for most of a week. Pretrial proceeding is a proceeding in which the prosecution and defense review the evidence, determine what evidence is going to be admitted and what evidence is not going to be admitted. It takes about twice as long as it should take because Mumia is inexperienced, but he's not disruptive. We go through the proceeding. He probably loses some rounds he maybe shouldn't have lost because he doesn't really know what he's doing, but he's still not doing too badly. We get through the pretrial process, and then we start what's called the voir dire. The voir dire is the jury selection process, okay? That means you look at all the potential jurors and you start questioning them. So Mumia starts questioning the potential jurors. We get through the first day. It's going slowly. They go through about 8 or 9 potential jurors. They should have gone through more. But again, you have an inexperienced person. And they actually agree and select the first member of the jury. Then we get to the second day of jury selection. We get to about 3 jurors through to the 11th potential person in this voir dire. This juror seems a little nervous. And at one point, she starts to say to the judge, you know, I don't think I'd be a good juror. And the prosecuting attorney says, "Are you nervous, ma'am?" And she says, "I'm nervous, but that's not why." And he interrupts her. He doesn't let her go on. He says, "Are you scared?" And she says, "Oh, I'm really scared." And the prosecuting attorney turns to the judge and says, "We can't have this." And Mumia says, "What do you mean? I'm interviewing this person." And the judge calls a sidebar conference, and they all come together, and they all sit there, and they talk about it. And you've got Mumia, and you've got his backup counsel, and you've got the prosecutor, and you've got the judge, and the prosecutor's saying, by questioning these jurors, this defendant is intimidating them. And Mumia says, "I'm not being disruptive." And the prosecutor says what to me is the key thing at that point. "I am not claiming Mumia is being disruptive at this point. The point, Your Honor, is that by questioning these jurors, he's intimidating them because they have to decide on his fate." Well, then they go through like a 20-page in the transcript process in which the judge then rules that Mumia can no longer continue to conduct the voir dire because he's intimidating the jury. Now, so Mumia sits down and he watches this. Now, the defense attorneys claim in their appeal that the reason Mumia was prevented by the judge and the prosecutor from continuing to question potential jurors was because he was becoming a human being to them. He was making a positive impression on them. I've read the transcript, and I don't believe that for a second. What I think was happening is the jury was showing its hostility towards Mumia. Juror after juror was getting really angry. How dare this big black man in dreadlocks question me? And what was happening was it was becoming apparent that a hostile jury was being impaneled. And the judge and the prosecutor didn't want that to happen, that it to be so evident in the transcript. So they prevented Mumia from continuing. So what did Mumia see? Mumia saw that he had an incompetent counsel. He saw that a hostile jury was being impaneled against him. And he saw the judge and the prosecutor acting, conspiring with each other, if I can use that word, to make sure that that happened. So when the trial opened, seeing all these things, Mumia said, "Your Honor, this trial is a joke," and he became disruptive. And as far as I'm concerned, he was on trial for his life, and he had every right to do so. Because if you were on trial for your life and you saw that constellation of things happen to you, that's what I would claim a lot of people would do, fighting for their lives. That's certainly what I'd hope I had the courage to do in that situation.
You say the jury was becoming antagonistic.
And what you have there is, yes, the jury, no, the jurors who were being questioned.
When he was questioning the jury.
Yeah, they were getting angry.
So the judge, by denying him the right to voir dire, when in actuality was seeking to impanel an impartial jury, not one that
Well,
was
what the judge was seeking to
antagonistic
do
and already
was to
predisposed
prevent
find
this
him
record.
guilty.
The judge was seeking to prevent a record of jury hostility from being presented.
So you're assuming that the judge was prejudiced at this
Well,
time.
I think it's obvious the judge was prejudiced.
Okay, you're not assuming that the judge is acting out of in the good interest of the defendant in order to ensure an impartial jury was
Right.
impaneled.
I think that's my reading of the transcript.
Okay. And you also say that the counsel was incompetent,
Um,
Mr. Jackson.
Yeah, Jackson was
Mr.
incompetent.
Jackson had tried 20 first-degree murder trials.
Mr. Jackson
He-
claimed to do that.
No, that's
W-
matter of fact.
Name
That's
one.
a statement.
Cite me a case.
It's statement of fact in here.
No, what do you
He's
mean
had
statement
20
of
he's had
fact?
Only six.
He'd never
Resulted in
tried a
conviction.
capital case before. This is one of the he made claims that he'd made those charges, but then he was disbarred. He was brought up on charges and disbarred.
So
I
every client that's ever had a lawyer disbarred has.
no, but the
automatically
point is he really did not make the 20. It was claimed that he did, but he didn't.
You also claim, okay, I'll concede that.
Yeah.
You also claim that
I know we're
they
going to go
never had
on
any,
for a
they
while,
never had
but-
any funds.
Well, what I
Nah.
was thinking was maybe
You know,
we could have a discussion.
Yeah, maybe we could talk later. Actually, the
Well, I was
claim was
hoping
that
some
the
people
claim.
might get some,
Right.
an alternative view besides free
Right.
money.
Well, let me just. I'll say.
That's good.
I don't want to go on for too long on this, but I can say that there's the Fraternal Order of Police has set up a website.
And I'll admit, I've been in law enforcement
Yeah.
for 6 years.
They've set up a website and they've published portions of the trial transcript, and in fact, a good portion of the trial transcript. I don't think they've actually included the section of the voir dire that I talked about, and I think there's a good reason they didn't do that. And the point is that's why we need a new trial, to get through and to understand all of this, so that we see the details. Yes, the defense was given about $1,400, if I believe, in a capital case. Yes, there have been claims by some supporters of Mumia that the defense was only given $130, not $1,400. Yes, there have been exaggerations made. I've read, you're in law enforcement. I worked for appeals court judges for a couple of years. Part of my job was reading trial transcripts of cases below. And I have not read the entire transcript of this case. We're talking about 5,000 pages of trial transcript and 7,000 pages of post-conviction review, 12,000 pages in all. Haven't read them all. I have read several thousand pages of the transcript, and enough to convince me that if ever there was a blueprint for an unfair trial, this is it. And I don't think that trial would have stood up to one round of appeal in Massachusetts. At least I hope it wouldn't. With our appointed rather than elected judges. But anyway, let's go on to the next question. I'm sorry to the audience for taking quite so long, but I think it's important to discuss these things and you can't convince people if you cannot deal with counter-arguments.
My question actually goes back to, I think, which is the real topic of your discourse here, and that is the why capital punishment is something that you object to. You also mentioned that it was a monumental move against capital punishment. I would like to hear your opinion about the rise of pro-capital punishment in this country, and not just as a lawyer, but primarily as an anthropologist. And so, if you could, please.
Oh boy, as an anthropologist, boy, I left that behind a long time ago. First of all, I want to say something which may not sit very well with some people. I don't really care what percentage of the public support capital punishment. I don't think this should be a Roman circus where we stick our thumbs up or we stick our thumbs down to see whether people live or die by majority vote. If the citizens of the state of South Carolina, so many of them seem to love their Confederate flag so much, if they were to hold a referendum and vote to reinstitute slavery, I would still be opposed to it. I think there are some things that should not be left to majority decision. We've got the technology now. We could put this all on the internet. We could have people vote. We could have juror of 100 million. If the majority of people say capital punishment, okay, capital punishment. If they don't, life imprisonment. We could set up a system like that. I'd still be opposed to it. I'd still think it was wrong. The anthropology of why we have pro-capital punishment sentiment. Well, I'm not sure that it's growing. It grew for a while. I think the most recent polls have shown some drop. You know, politicians who want to demonstrate that they're tough on crime can say, I'm in favor of capital punishment, and appeal to the public and make it look as if they're actually accomplishing something. It's a simple solution. It also is a reflection of violence. I mean, you know, we are an extremely violent society. We like violent solutions. There is, you know, I find it amazing, you know, when all the talk of the Columbine killings, you know, and the horrible things that happened out there, the fact that, you know, here was somebody who wanted to be in the Marine Corps. The idea that nobody seems to think that there's any correlation between the fact that we're such a violent society and the fact that we have the most successful military machine on earth, that our country has fought war after war after war and won them all, and we've been victorious. And what does this teach people? You know, violence works. It is successful. We have proven it. We are at the top of the hill. Nobody better mess with us or we're going to blow them away. And so is it surprising that we have a society that supports capital punishment? Because we grow up with that attitude. The very success of our own military is largely responsible, I believe, for the violent nature in our society. I know a lot of people find that extremely unacceptable. You know, that's a traitorous sentiment to express. But I only think it follows. So if we're going to look at it from a social and anthropological point of view, but I also think that, you know, the media loves a good story, loves to whip up sentiment, loves to get people involved, and so we get a lot of pro-capital punishment media. And I think, unfortunately, we are extremely well tuned to, you know, the most successful brainwashing in the world is the brainwashing that you don't know about. That it's so subtle that you don't even realize it's happening to you. And by the time we are 7 years old, we've watched so much TV. It is so much the window of that we see on the world. It tells us what products to buy, how to live our lives, what we measure success by, and we become so programmed, and we don't even realize that it's happened to us. And part of that programming is, I think, a pro-capital punishment message. But I also think that an anti-capital punishment movement has grown in this society. It has grown phenomenally, because I've never known of an execution that increases support for capital punishment. But it seems to me that with each execution that takes place, there are more people who are against it. So I guess I'm optimistic. I think the governor of Illinois, a pro-capital punishment governor of Illinois, putting a moratorium on capital punishment in that state when all these people were shown to be innocent and were released from death row, that's a new chapter. That's a major new development. And there's some major new understandings. I think there are a lot of people who are not necessarily anti-capital punishment who are beginning to see that even if they might in theory favor capital punishment, in reality it's not going to work. Other questions, or we've gone on pretty long. If people want the newsletter, if they want to come up and talk informally, I'm very happy to continue this discussion with people. And I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you.